Young lady, Judge Harrison said, leaning forward, both palms flat on the bench. Sit down right now. She didn't sit down. She took one more step forward past the wooden divider that separated the public from the court. The bailiff grabbed her arm. She pulled it free. A reporter in the back row stopped typing. One of the jurors actually leaned sideways to see past the person in front of her. Daniel Brooks, the billionaire sitting at the prosecutor's table as the star witness of his own manufactured tragedy, let out a short, quiet laugh. The kind of laugh that says, "This is beneath me."
He should have paid more attention to that girl, because in exactly 10 minutes, Daniel Brooks would lose everything. His empire, his reputation, his freedom, taken apart piece by a 17-year-old with a laptop and a red USB drive and a rage that had been building for 6 months. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened in Courtroom 3B of the Fulton County Courthouse on that sweltering Atlanta afternoon. You have to understand what was at stake. You have to understand the man in the orange jumpsuit. You have to understand the man in the Italian suit. And you have to understand exactly how a billionaire used an innocent father as a human shield to hide one of the most audacious financial crimes in the state's history. Atlanta in summer is its own kind of pressure. The heat doesn't just hang in the air, it presses down. It seeps into buildings, into courtrooms, into the spaces between words. Courtroom 3B was built in 1938, and its air conditioning had been losing the argument against Georgia summers for about 20 years. On the day this story reaches its turning point, the vents were blowing warm air into a room already thick with tension, the kind of tension that wraps around your throat and makes every breath feel deliberate. Marcus Johnson sat at the defense table in a faded orange jumpsuit 2 sizes too large. His wrists were shackled to a chain around his waist. The shackles were standard issue. The court didn't see him as a man. They saw him as a flight risk, a threat, a number on a docket, but to his daughter watching from the second row, those chains were a statement. They were the physical language of a system that had already decided. Marcus was 46 years old. He had spent 22 years building something rare in any industry, an unblemished professional reputation. He wasn't just good at his job as a financial analyst. He was the kind of man who called out errors in his own reports before anyone else noticed them. The kind of man who stayed late not to impress anyone, but because something wasn't right, and he couldn't leave until it was. He had built his career on a foundation of precision and integrity so solid that when Vanguard Logistics was drowning 3 years earlier, they called him to pull them out. He pulled them out, and then they used that trust to bury him alive. Across the room, Daniel Brooks occupied his chair the way kings occupy thrones. He was 61, silver-haired, wearing a suit that most people in that courtroom would have needed 2 months of salary to afford. He sat at the edge of the prosecution's space, technically a witness, practically the director of the entire production. Every few minutes he'd lean toward the lead prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious man named Miller, and murmur something. Miller would nod. Brooks would lean back. The performance was seamless, a devastated business leader, a betrayed friend, a reluctant participant in the prosecution of a man he once called a colleague. It was the finest acting Marcus Johnson had ever seen. The charges against Marcus were federal, severe, and stacked. Corporate espionage, aggravated wire fraud, grand theft, embezzlement. The prosecution's theory was detailed and damning, that Marcus, serving as Vanguard's CFO, had quietly siphoned nearly $5 million into a web of offshore shell companies across a 2-year period, exploiting his access to the company's financial architecture to steal from the inside. The evidence package was comprehensive: IP logs, digital signatures, transfer records, all pointing at Marcus's accounts, Marcus's office computer, Marcus's home network. The jury had been watching this evidence for 3 days. Most of them looked like they'd already made up their minds. Sitting in the second row, Maya Johnson understood with the clarity of someone who had been staring at this nightmare for 6 months that the evidence was a work of art, a forged one, but a masterpiece nonetheless. She was 17. She was wearing that ironed blazer. She had a backpack under her feet that contained a laptop, several hundred pages of printed server logs, and a red USB drive that represented 6 months of her life. 6 months of no sleep, deferred college applications, black coffee at 3 a.m., and a grief so specific and white-hot it had transformed itself into something useful. Rage directed precisely. She watched Brooks step down from the witness stand, having just finished a testimony so polished it could have been rehearsed, because it had been. He caught her eye as he walked back to his seat. The smile that moved across his face was small, controlled, designed to be deniable. but she saw it. "We both know how this ends," that smile said. He was wrong about that. You cannot understand the crime without understanding the relationship, and you cannot understand the relationship without going back 3 years, when Daniel Brooks took over as CEO of Vanguard Logistics. The company was bleeding from every financial artery: bad contracts, worse accounting, and a leadership structure that had confused activity with strategy. The board of directors was weeks away from entertaining acquisition offers, desperate fire sale offers, when Brooks arrived with a vision and a very short list of people he needed to execute it. Marcus Johnson was at the top of that list. Brooks pursued Marcus directly. Not through recruiters, not through intermediaries, but personally: phone calls, dinners, a handwritten letter that Marcus kept in his desk drawer, because he was a man who appreciated the deliberate gesture. Brooks told Marcus the truth about the company's condition and asked him to do the impossible: restructure the financial framework from the foundation. Build a system that could survive what Vanguard had done to itself. Marcus did it in 14 months. During that time, Brooks was in and out of their home. He sat at their dining table. He learnt their daughter's name. He asked about her college plans, made jokes with Marcus's wife, projected the warm, magnetic energy of a man who understood that loyalty was the only real currency. Marcus trusted him the way you trust someone who has sat in your kitchen and eaten your food, completely and without the armor you wear with strangers. That trust became the murder weapon. The frame-up was not impulsive, it was architectural. It began with what Brooks called the special projects. Late on Friday afternoons, when the office had thinned out and the week's official business was done, Brooks would call Marcus into his private office. He'd pour 2 glasses of expensive scotch. He always poured 2, always made it feel like a partnership, and he'd place a stack of authorization forms on the desk. Emergency funding approvals, acquisition sign-offs, capital releases for projects that were, Brooks explained, highly confidential strategic moves. "The board doesn't need to see this yet," Brooks would say. "Once it materializes, we'll loop them in. For now, just process the paperwork. And trust me." Marcus trusted him. He signed. He didn't know that the acquisitions didn't exist. He didn't know that the capital he was releasing was flowing into a network of phantom companies incorporated in the Cayman Islands, each one controlled entirely by Daniel Brooks. He didn't know that his own digital signature, his own authentication token, was being used as the paper trail for a theft he was committing without knowing it. By the time Brooks was done, he had stolen nearly $5 million from his own company, from his own investors, from the employee pension funds that working people had spent careers building. He had used Marcus's access, Marcus's credibility, and Marcus's signature to do it. And then he reported himself as the victim. The arrest happened on a Tuesday evening in November. Maya remembers the exact quality of the light. She was at the kitchen island wrestling with AP calculus, the kind of problem that requires pencil marks on 4 separate scratch pages before the actual solution. Her father was at the stove making spaghetti. The TV was on low. Everything was ordinary. The door did not open. It was breached. Federal agents in tactical gear flooded the house with the particular efficiency of people executing a plan. The lights outside, blue and red, layered on top of each other, turned the living room into something that looked like a nightmare. Maya screamed. She remembers screaming and not being able to hear herself over the noise. 2 agents slammed Marcus against the kitchen counter. The pot of spaghetti hit the floor. Steam billowed up from the tile. Maya, her father had said, over the agents' voices, over the handcuffs locking around his wrists, over the chaos. "Call Uncle David, it's a mistake. I love you. It's a mistake. It was not a mistake." The next morning, Daniel Brooks held a press conference on the steps of Vanguard Logistics headquarters. He wore a charcoal suit. He looked appropriately shattered. His voice broke in exactly the right places as he told the assembled cameras that Marcus Johnson, a man he had trusted, a man he had called a friend, had betrayed every promise he'd made. The statement was 600 words of weaponized grief. Every sentence reinforced the narrative. Every pause said, "I am the victim here." The media did the rest. Within 72 hours, Marcus was the headline. The trusted executive turned inside thief was the kind of story that writes its own sequel. Within a week, the family's assets were frozen. Marcus's bail was set at $2 million, a number designed to keep him in county lockup, which it did. He sat in a cell while Brooks flew to a client retreat in the Maldives. The digital trail that buried Marcus was not clumsy. Brooks had hired professionals, people who existed in the grey market between cybersecurity and cybercrime, to build an IP architecture that pointed every transaction directly at Marcus. The transfers were logged as originating from Marcus's office terminal during business hours and from his home network in the early morning, between 1 and 4 a.m., the timestamps designed to suggest a man conducting his crimes under cover of darkness. They planted encrypted files on Marcus's secondary hard drive. They routed authentication confirmations through his email account. By the time the FBI forensic team arrived, the digital house was built. The trail was clear. The story was consistent. The only problem with a perfect frame is the person wearing it tends to know it doesn't fit. But knowing and proving are two entirely different countries, separated by an ocean. Marcus's court-appointed attorney was a man named Thomas Hayes. Thomas Hayes was not a corrupt man. He was not lazy, not malicious, not personally indifferent to his client's fate. He was exactly what happens when a system overloads its most important positions. He was buried. 70 active cases. Clients in county lockup, clients in state prison, clients waiting on plea offers in 3 different jurisdictions. He was a decent man being asked to do an indecent thing, adequately defend every one of them, and he was failing all of them by trying. In their first meeting, Hayes spread the prosecution's evidence across the metal table in the visitors' room and told Marcus and Maya the truth as he understood it. The case was a mountain. The dual authentication token, the digital key used to authorize every transfer, had Marcus's credentials embedded in every transaction. The IP logs were consistent. The forged signatures were good enough that even forensic accountants had signed off on their authenticity. Going to trial meant gambling against overwhelming odds. "Take the deal," Hayes had said. 7 years on one count, they drop everything else. Maya had leaned across the table before Marcus could answer. "He didn't do this," she said. "It wasn't a plea, it was a declaration." "I believe you," Hayes said, and he meant it, "but belief doesn't cross-examine evidence. Your father's authentication token was used on every single transfer. He physically signed the authorization forms." "To a jury, that's the case. Because Brooks had access to his office," Maya said. "Because Brooks is the one who handed him those forms and stood over his shoulder while he signed them. The whole thing was engineered." Hayes sighed the sigh of someone who had heard innocent people tell true stories before and watched those stories lose to paper trails. "A theory," he said. "Without evidence, it's a theory." Marcus looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at his attorney. "I am an innocent man," Marcus said quietly. "I will not plead guilty to a crime I did not commit. We go to trial." From that day forward, Maya stopped being a high school senior. She deferred her acceptances. She told her friends she was busy. She turned her bedroom into something that looked, by month 2, like the research space of a detective who had stopped caring about aesthetics and started caring only about the truth. Printed spreadsheets covered the walls, red string connected timeline events. Hayes had shared the discovery documents before losing interest in them, and Maya had read every page, including the pages that Hayes had marked as too technical for trial. She taught herself the basics of network forensics. She read about IP spoofing, about MAC addresses, about the difference between what a summary log reports and what the raw data underneath it actually contains. She read Brady v. Maryland and every major case that cited it. She built a working understanding of digital evidence admissibility by reading law journals at 2 in the morning with a highlighter in one hand and a coffee in the other. She was looking for the seam. Every manufactured thing has one. The place where the fabrication meets reality and doesn't quite line up. She found it at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin. The hexadecimal server logs were not the kind of document anyone reads voluntarily. They were dense, raw, almost aggressively technical, thousands of lines of alphanumeric data that recorded every packet of information that moved through Vanguard's network. The FBI had received these files as part of the evidence package and had relied primarily on the summary reports that Brooks's own IT team had prepared. The summary reports were clean, organized, and pointed directly at Marcus. The raw logs were something else. Maya was cross-referencing the October 12th timestamp, the night of the largest single transfer, $1.5 million, when she noticed something buried in the routing header of the transaction record. Camouflaged inside what appeared to be a routine diagnostic ping, a standard piece of background network noise, was a secondary hardware identifier, a MAC address. A media access control address is not like an IP address. An IP address can be spoofed. It can be masked, mimicked, redirected. A MAC address is different. It is a unique identifier hard-coded into the physical network card of a device. It does not travel across the internet the way an IP address does, which is exactly why whoever built this particular digital frame hadn't thought to remove it. It was an internal log, the kind of data the Vanguard servers captured automatically and stored without displaying it in any report. Maya wrote the address down. She cross-referenced it against the Vanguard hardware registry, a backup database file her father had saved on an old drive in the garage as part of his normal IT housekeeping, the kind of thorough documentation habit that turned out to be the thread that unraveled everything. The MAC address belonged to one device. Terminal 1, Executive Office Suite. Registered user, Daniel Brooks. She brought it to Hayes at 7:30 the following morning. She showed him the logs. She showed him the cross-reference. She walked him through the significance of a MAC address versus an IP address, through why this particular data point proved that someone using Brooks's private terminal had remotely accessed Vanguard's servers and executed the transfer while spoofing Marcus's IP as the apparent origin. Hayes looked at the screen for a long time. "Maya," he said finally, "this is a string of numbers. It's a hardware identifier," she said. "It's proof. It's technical evidence that requires an expert witness to interpret, and the prosecution will bring in their own expert to muddy the water. And I'll have spent whatever credibility we have chasing a theory. The jury will find confusing. The jury doesn't understand hexadecimal logs. Judges don't like confusion. Confusion becomes reasonable doubt that cuts the wrong way. We have the MAC address," Maya said. "We can subpoena the terminal. We'd need a forensic imaging specialist, a network analyst, probably 2 weeks of back-and-forth technical testimony."
Mr.
"Hayes," Maya said, and her voice had gone very quiet in a way that was more alarming than shouting would have been. "My father is innocent." "I know," Hayes said. He closed the laptop. "I believe you, but I don't think I can win with this." He did not submit the MAC address evidence. He did not subpoena the executive terminal. He carried the knowledge of what Maya had found into the trial and buried it under the weight of everything else he was carrying, and the trial began without it. Day 3 arrived like a sentence being read aloud. Brooks testified for the better part of the morning session. He was extraordinary on the stand, measured, specific, occasionally emotional in the carefully calibrated way of someone who knows where the cameras are pointed. He talked about the betrayal of trust. He talked about the sleepless nights after the discovery. He looked at Marcus during portions of his testimony with an expression so perfectly tuned to devastated disappointment that one of the jurors actually shook her head. Miller, the prosecutor, walked him through each transaction with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the choreography. Every answer landed. Every piece of documentation reinforced the last. By the time Brooks stepped off the stand, he had turned $5 million of stolen money into a story about loyalty betrayed, and the jury had followed every step. Hayes's cross-examination lasted 11 minutes. He asked about the authorization forms. Brooks explained them away with the smooth fluency of someone who had prepared for exactly that line of questioning. Hayes asked 2 follow-up questions, neither of which landed, and then sat down. "No further questions, Your Honor." The words fell into the room like a verdict. Miller stood up. "The state rests its case, Your Honor." Judge Harrison turned his gaze to the defense table. He was a man who had spent 3 decades on the bench. He had seen every version of courtroom theater and courtroom collapse. What he saw at the defense table now was the specific stillness of an attorney who has run out of moves and knows it. "Mr. Hayes, is the defense prepared to call witnesses?" Hayes got to his feet slowly. He straightened his jacket with the careful movements of someone buying time with small adjustments. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the jury. He looked at the floor. "Your Honor," he began. His voice had the quality of a man swallowing something bitter. "The defense." He paused. The room held its breath. "The defense rests." The collective exhale that moved through the gallery was not relief. It was the sound of a room absorbing a catastrophe. Reporters looked up from their notes. 3 jurors exchanged glances. Marcus dropped his head into his hands, the chains between his wrists making a small, quiet sound against the edge of the defense table. Daniel Brooks let out a single soft breath, the breath of a man who just got exactly what he came for. In the second row, something in Maya Johnson broke open. Not her composure, not her resolve. Something that was holding back. Her composure gave way. The last wall between the girl who had been managing her terror for 6 months and the girl who understood that if she didn't move in the next 30 seconds, her father would spend the rest of his life in a cage for a crime committed by the man sitting 20 feet away, adjusting his silk tie. She grabbed her backpack. She stood up. She said, "Excuse me," to the people in her row, and the way she said it, calm, deliberate, cutting through the noise, made the people around her move before they'd consciously decided to. She stepped into the main aisle. She walked past the wooden divider. "Miss," the bailiff said, stepping forward, "you cannot." "She didn't stop, young lady," Judge Harrison said, and his voice was not the voice he used for procedural housekeeping. It was the voice he used when he needed the room to understand that something was about to end. "Sit down, right now." Maya stopped at the defense table. She placed both hands on the railing. Her knuckles went white. She looked up at the judge, and she did not look away. The room went completely still. "With all due respect, Your Honor." Her voice was clear, steady. The kind of steady that comes not from the absence of fear, but from something that has grown large enough to sit on top of fear and keep it in place. The defense isn't resting. The defense gave up. "There's a difference, objection." Miller started. This man, Maya, pointed at Hayes, who looked like he was watching a dream become a catastrophe. "Is not resting, he's surrendering. He has evidence that proves my father's innocence, and he refused to use it because he was afraid it was complicated. If he won't do his job, I will." Daniel Brooks's smile was gone. His face had gone a very particular shade, not anger, not contempt, but the bloodless grey of someone who has just heard the name of something they buried a long time ago and thought was gone. "I have the proof," Maya said. She unzipped the backpack. "Right here." She pulled out the red USB drive and held it up. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison's chambers smelled like old paper and coffee and 3 decades of accumulated decisions. He sat behind his desk. Miller stood to one side, his jaw tight. Hayes hovered near the door with the energy of a man who would like to cease to exist. Brooks stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 attorneys in suits that collectively cost more than the monthly mortgage on the house. Marcus had been taken from in handcuffs. "Plug it in," Judge Harrison said. Maya plugged the drive into the judge's computer. Her hands were shaking. She was aware of them shaking, and she did not have the spare bandwidth to make them stop, so she let them shake, and she navigated to the files anyway. She opened the October 12th hexadecimal log. She found the block she had memorized. She highlighted it. "This is the raw data for the $1.5 million transfer," she said. Her voice steadied as she moved into the data. The data she knew, the data she had stared at for 3 weeks until she could see it with her eyes closed. The prosecution's evidence only shows the top-level IP address, which reads as our home network. But look at the packet header. She highlighted 12 characters. "That is a MAC address. It is a unique hardware identifier embedded in the network card of a physical device. It cannot be mimicked the way an IP address can. It records the actual machine that issued the command." She opened the second document, the Vanguard hardware registry. She hit Control F. She pasted the address. She hit Enter. The cursor jumped to a single line. Judge Harrison leaned forward and read it aloud. Terminal 1 Executive Office Suite. User, Daniel Brooks. The silence that followed was a different kind than the silence in the courtroom. That silence had been the silence of spectacle. This silence was the silence of a room in which something has just become undeniable. Miller turned slowly to look at Daniel Brooks. Brooks was sweating. The perfectly constructed facade, the silver hair, the bespoke suit, the posture of a man who has never lost anything he cared about, had dissolved. What was left was just a man, and the man was frightened. "Mr. Brooks," Miller said. His voice had dropped to something quiet and precise. "Is this hardware registry accurate?" Brooks's mouth opened. His attorneys were already moving toward him, one of them leaning in close, the words coming fast and low. "My client," Brooks's lead attorney said, stepping forward with the mechanical composure of someone executing a contingency plan, asserts his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. "We request—" "That's enough," Judge Harrison said. He looked at Daniel Brooks for a long moment. He had spent 30 years watching people lie in his courtroom. He had become fluent in the specific body language of a person who has been caught, the way they redistribute their weight, the way their eyes stop landing on anything, the way the energy that had been radiating confidence 30 minutes ago now had nowhere to go. "Mr. Miller," Judge Harrison said slowly, "I believe you have some decisions to make." Miller nodded. He looked at Marcus's file. He looked at the screen. He looked at the judge. "The state moves to dismiss all charges against Marcus Johnson with prejudice," he said, immediately. Maya's hand went to her mouth. The sound she made was not a word. It was the sound of 6 months of weight leaving a person's body all at once. "Motion granted," Judge Harrison said. He stood. He looked at Maya for a moment that neither of them would forget. The expression on his face was not the expression he wore for rulings or for reprimands. It was something closer to the look a person gives when they have witnessed something they hadn't expected to believe in. "Miss Johnson," he said, "let's go deliver a verdict." The courtroom doors opened and the room lurched back to life. Maya walked to her father. She didn't run. She walked, steady, deliberate, the same way she had walked past that wooden divider 40 minutes ago. And when she reached Marcus, she wrapped both arms around him and buried her face in his shoulder and cried. Not the measured, controlled tears of a girl holding herself together, the real kind. 6 months of real. Marcus was confused for 3 seconds. Then he understood. He wrapped his shackled arms around her as far as they would go and held her, and said her name over and over into her hair. Order. Judge Harrison's gavel came down. The room went still. In the matter of the state versus Marcus Johnson, the judge began, his voice carrying the full weight of the bench he had occupied for 30 years. Based on exculpatory evidence brought to the court's attention in chambers, evidence which establishes severe misconduct on the part of the complaining witness, and upon the state's own motion, all charges are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Johnson, you are a free man. The gallery came apart. Reporters stood up. Voices erupted. Someone in the back rows was applauding. The sound washed over Marcus like something physical. He collapsed forward onto the defense table, shoulders shaking. 30 years of integrity and 6 months of chains and orange jumpsuits and his daughter's voice in his ear every Saturday through a scratched plexiglass window, all of it releasing at once. "Bailiff," Judge Harrison said over the noise, "remove Mr. Johnson's restraints." The bailiff walked over, keys already in hand. The chains fell away. Marcus straightened. He looked at his hands. He looked at his daughter. "You did it," he said. He could barely get the words out. "You did this. We have one more thing to watch," Maya said. She was right. Across the room, Daniel Brooks was halfway to the exit with his legal team forming a moving barrier around him. Heads down, momentum up. The organized retreat of people who know when a building is about to collapse. Miller's voice stopped him at the door. "Daniel Brooks." Brooks turned around. His face was composed, but his eyes were not. "By order of the District Attorney's Office, you are detained pending formal charges for perjury, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and federal wire fraud." The 2 deputies standing near the back of the room converged with the smooth efficiency of a choreography that had been ready to execute since Miller returned from chambers. They turned Brooks around. They placed his hands behind his back. The handcuffs closed around his wrists with a sound that had a particular quality in that particular room. A sound that everyone present understood was not just mechanical. "Do you know who I am?" Brooks said. His voice cracked on the second word. "I will sue this city into the ground. I will." The deputies walked him through the doors. His threats faded down the hallway. As they pushed him through the doorway, Brooks looked back over his shoulder. His eyes found Maya across the room. She was standing next to her father. She was not smiling. She was not performing anything for anyone. She just looked at him with the steady, unflinching gaze of someone who had been right all along, and had finally proven it. The doors closed. The fall of Daniel Brooks was total, swift, and public in the way that only large-scale financial crime discovered in real time can be. Within 48 hours of his courtroom arrest, federal agents were inside Vanguard Logistics headquarters, using Maya's MAC address data as the starting point. Forensic accountants began pulling apart Brooks's private server architecture. What they found was not a contained theft of $5 million. What they found was a decade of systematic fraud, a layered Ponzi scheme through which Brooks had been quietly draining his company, his investors, and the pension contributions of ordinary employees to sustain a lifestyle he had never legitimately been able to afford. The number, when the accounting was complete, exceeded $60 million. The Vanguard board fired Brooks and filed civil suits before the federal indictment was even formalized. The government moved to seize his assets, the properties, the vehicles, the offshore accounts that Maya's data trail had already mapped. His wife, upon understanding that the money was gone and the name was now a liability, filed for divorce and relocated to Europe with their children. 7 months after walking out of Fulton County Courthouse in handcuffs, Daniel Brooks walked into a federal courtroom in an orange jumpsuit. He was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security facility. No possibility of parole. The same jumpsuits. A different man wearing them now. Healing is not a moment, it is a direction. The Johnson family moved in that direction slowly. The way people move when they have been injured deeply enough that they can't rush without reopening something. The civil settlement that Vanguard's board offered, comprehensive, substantial. The board understood the PR catastrophe of having nearly imprisoned an innocent man, gave Marcus the tools to begin rebuilding. He paid for his wife's continued care. He brought her home. She recovered. Not immediately. Not easily. But she came back to herself, in the house she'd been taken from, in the kitchen where the spaghetti had hit the floor, and slowly the kitchen became itself again. Marcus chose not to return to corporate finance. The world that had rewarded him, and then weaponized his reputation, held no more appeal. He opened a non-profit financial literacy center in their neighborhood, a place where families who had been targeted by predatory lenders could learn to protect themselves, where the systems that had been used against people like him could be made legible to the people those systems most often harmed. He named it after his daughter's middle name. 4 years after a bailiff's hand had closed around her arm, in Courtroom 3B, Maya Johnson walked across the stage at Spelman College, summa cum laude, pre-law and forensic data analysis. In the front row, Marcus stood. He cried without any effort to conceal it, the way people cry when they have already been broken and rebuilt, and understand that being seen in a moment of joy is not something to hide from. Maya had applied to Harvard Law School. She was accepted on a full merit scholarship. She didn't tell anyone why she had chosen law until her orientation interview, when a professor asked her what had brought her to this particular work. She thought for a moment. "The justice system is a machine," she said. "Like any machine, it can be used to build things or destroy them. And like any machine, it can be repaired. I want to be the person who figures out what's broken and fixes it." The professor asked her what had given her that framework. Maya smiled. The kind of smile that carries a whole story inside it. "My father," she said, "and 10 minutes in a courtroom when I was 17. What happened in Courtroom 3B that afternoon was not a miracle. Miracles require divine intervention. What happened was something rarer and more fragile. A person who refused to accept what everyone around her insisted was inevitable. A girl who read the logs that trained investigators had set aside, who learned the vocabulary of digital forensics from library books and late nights, who walked past the divider because she understood with the absolute clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose but the truth, that if she didn't move, no one would. The truth, Marcus Johnson had always taught his daughter, is never entirely gone. It leaves traces in the hexadecimal noise of a server log, in a 12-character hardware identifier embedded in the metadata no one thought to read, in the space between what a summary report says and what the raw data underneath it actually proves. You just have to want it badly enough to look. And you have to be brave enough to walk to the front of the room when you find it and say out loud in front of everyone who has decided the outcome already, "Not today. Not this time. Not my father."